Anything needs regular maintenance, including trains. But if something were to not allow those machines to be maintained, then they would start to deteriorate. Well, that's exactly what happened to Victoria's railways during the war. This rebuilding was called Operation Phoenix, and in this week's video, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it. For 2.5 decades, much of Victoria's railways were neglected, meaning not much was spent on railways, thus leading to an overall decline in pretty much all railway infrastructure. Upgrades were affected by the Great Depression, in which there simply wasn't enough money to maintain the engines and pay the workers, and World War II, where all materials were directed for wartime use, which forced VR to perform only the most necessary of maintenance. During these years of neglect, the building of new stock would have been unheard of, leading to most services in the early 50s to be run by 1910 stock. A railway of VR's size before the war would build an average of 25 locos, 30 to 40 passenger carriages, and 500 goods wagons per year. But in reality, VR was only able to build 4 locos and 200 wagons, leading to most of the stock on Victorian railways to be older than most other railways. As VR was also scrapping long overdue locos at this time, this meant the fleet was overall reduced. This would bite VR on the tender, as World War II was just around the corner, meaning more trains would have to run to serve the war, meaning the need for more stock, which they didn't have. Most passenger engines at this time would have to be put on goods duty, which shows the desperation of VR. The government of the day, Albert Dunstan, would also restrict passenger travel, with even more services cut due to fuel shortages. Buffet cars were also removed at this time. Despite all the service cuts, in 1948 to 1949, all country passenger services were up 76%. Suburban passenger services were up 22%, and goods traffic was up 53%, compared to 1938 to 1939, which were considered the best pre-war years. This meant that the railway was ever more desperate for rolling stock. At the end of the war, some small upgrades were done, these being the introduction of new overland carriages. However, not enough was being done, and in 1949, a review of VR was requested by Transport Minister at the time, Kent Hughes, and was carried out by, oddly enough, Chief Executive of British Rails, John Elliott. Elliott criticized the critically run-down rolling stock and the entire network as a whole. He said that the entire network would be too worn out to operate in a decade if something wasn't done. The review's only praise was the staff of the railway, which is something we still have going for us. After this review, VR started seriously to consider the upgrading of the network, which they were already considering. See the Ashworth Improvement Plan. But it didn't happen sooner, as they didn't have the funds or the power. And in 1950, a report was published. This report was known as Operation Phoenix. How much of Operation Phoenix was completed? After 1952, Victorian Railways was nearly £6 million in deficit. Freight and passenger rates were both increased, but VR still did not expect to make a profit. The works for 1953 were the Alamein line duplication, track amplification from Richmond to South Yarra, a new Richmond station, and 1,500 new houses for railway staff. These would cost $12.5 million. However, loans were difficult to acquire, so VR had to cut the budget back to $6.8 million. Works were slow, and with the loss of a lot of manpower and thousands of tons of materials in storage, many proposals were cancelled, such as electrification to Gippsland, which only managed to reach Warragul, and around 500 pre-cut houses were cancelled. The underground city loop would also be pushed back for a future day, and following a different alignment. In June of 1952, most of the rolling stock ordered was in service, with all 50 N classes, 64 of the 70 R classes, all 60 J classes, 10 F class diesels, 26 of the 30 B class ordered, 25 L classes, all 30 walkers, 126 goods wagons built by VR, and 1,835 goods wagons built by outside contractors. Due to more funding issues, in 1953, work on building locomotives, carriages, trucks, and livestock wagons, outside rolling stock contractors were also told to minimize production until all the debt has been paid. Soon after, the rest of the R and B classes were delivered. Outcomes of the plan, and what can we see today? By 1953, the new mainline diesels were running 4,800 kilometers a week, 4 times as long as the best steam engines at the time. In addition, an hour had been cut off of all long-distance journeys. The Warragul electrification was eventually extended to Traralgon in 1996. Unfortunately, it was truncated from 1987 to 1998. Electrification to other main lines was also considered, but never actually implemented. Since new diesels were much more efficient than electrification, which nowadays would be the opposite answer, these few years would also see the most that Victorian railways had ever spent before 1984. The city loop was built at that time. On the topic of the city loop we see in the proposal is a little different to the one we have today. The city loop in the proposal seems to only have 2 tunnels, and one of the 2 tunnels curves off north at Flagstaff Gardens towards the Mernda and Hurstbridge lines. The 2 tunnels also seem to run under Lonsdale Street. Today, our tunnels run under Latrobe Street. The tunnels also encompass the MCG, go under Jolimont Railway Station, and through the Fitzroy Gardens. Which seems like a very weird way of building a tunnel, because the main point of building a tunnel is to be able to go through a structure without modifying it or tearing it down. The Mernda and Hurstbridge lines are also left out of the city loop in this proposal, which is another questionable decision. Let's say this is the city loop we actually got. How would services run? Debating how services run for this scenario is a very difficult task. But let's say the upgrades that have been completed post 1953 never happened, and no upgrades, closure, or electrifications has happened since. This would most likely be the network suburban map. I spent around an hour on it, so it isn't great, but I think this is how services would run if the city loop was built to this proposal in 1953. I can see many points of error and many bottlenecks. But now the question is, what can we still see of the plan today? Well, some steam engines built in the plan are preserved today, and some diesels are also somehow in operation, mostly for private freight companies, most notably Southern Short-Haul Railroads, which uses a lot of first-generation diesels, great for train spotters, okay for profits. Track duplication has also been done in recent years, such as the Hurstbridge and Lilydale line duplications. The plan basically saved the railways of Victoria as well. Otherwise, Victoria would probably have become a much worse Adelaide. But it was also the stepping stones for the 1969 Transportation Plan. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you liked this video about Operation Phoenix. If you have any suggestions on what video I should do next, then leave a comment below. And if not, like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.